Everybody to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We're all inviting Gail to come to our services.
Gail,
We have a
we have
campaign.
we have
It'll
room
be
for
a
you, Gail.
GoFundMe campaign to get Gail to come to services.
There's Ava.
Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you perfect. We turn off the recording, but we're still on YouTube. That's why we turn it off. So welcome everybody. Welcome to who we have on YouTube, to Michael, David, Flossie, Arlene, Eva, Gail, and the disembodied hand that we will call Ron. So excited to be here. Welcome to everybody on YouTube. We know we have tons, maybe millions of people on YouTube, literally. So welcome to the throngs of people on YouTube. And welcome David, who is living in, are you still in England?
Still, but hopefully we'll be.
I know you're traveling time to time.
Hopefully we'll be in Savannah permanently by October or November.
Oh wow, great!
Wow.
Yeah,
That is great.
getting moving estimates and doing all that.
Well, good luck with that. Well, we are going to talk about something a little less exciting today, but something so important apropos after completing the discussion on the presidents and the positive things they did for Judaism. We could talk about the negative stuff after the election, possibly, but generally speaking, the United States presidents have been very, very good for the Jews. Overall, it's not even close. Even when they haven't always done what we thought was appropriate, they were usually ahead of the curve for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So we can't rate them all anachronistically. We have to really look at what they were doing for the time period, and usually way ahead of the game, even when they are given strife from the Jewish community for various things, and that's our right because they don't always do what we want. But even so, they generally have had the best intentions for the Jewish community. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit different, obviously, because chosen by you, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism. And that is a really important topic because I think sometimes we talk about anti-Semitism and we forget that it's an evolving institution. And sometimes we claim something is anti-Semitism when it isn't. And sometimes we believe or don't even believe something is anti-Semitism, don't even have a thought about it, and it really is. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Just a little synopsis of how anti-Semitism has changed, grown, continued. Let's start first with when did anti-Semitism start? Because there's a lot of thought. Jews are persecuted by groups in the Bible, going all the way back to the time of the Egyptians. So some would say the Egyptians or even the groups that persecuted the Jews in Canaan were anti-Semitic. That is probably not true. Now, what is anti-Semitism is essential for understanding the difficulties. Anti-Semitism is when you persecute Jews for no reason at all. When the persecution is based solely on them being Jewish without reservation for what else is going on. When the Canaanites are attacking our brethren in ancient Israel, are they attacking them because they're Jewish? Is it anti-Semitism, or is it because that's the way things were? When King David is at war, you are at war. It's not necessarily anti-Semitism. It is we want to conquer you or we don't want to be conquered. So we have to really ensure that when we say anti-Semitism, the group that's committing anti-Semitism isn't doing it to everybody. Because if you're persecuting everybody, it's probably not anti-Semitism because we're just part of the group that's being persecuted. So I think a lot of people think the Romans, for instance, were the first great persecutors of Jews because there were laws but we have to understand probably not. The Romans were not persecuting Jews because they were Jews. At different periods, there were laws restraining us, and other periods there were not. What we have to understand is the Roman period, and we'll start, first century BCE for our purposes. The Roman period we know goes farther back, but that's when they take over Israel. The Romans are conquerors of the world. Anybody who wasn't Roman was considered lesser. There were different levels, certainly, but the Jews lived in a nondescript, insignificant part of the world. And they rebelled 3 major times. There was a rebellion while they were in Egypt, 2 big rebellions, and Rome did not like people that rebelled, especially the Bar Kokhba revolution in the 130s CE, because they had a lot of issues going on, and they're actually bringing in troops from the border of places where they have major wars and major concerns to come in the middle of nowhere and put down this revolt that is guerrilla warfare based. It took a lot of time, money, and energy, and they weren't anti-Semitic. They were just hateful because they had to do this. So they came and destroyed Israel and really just burnt the country to the ground. It wasn't because of the religion of the Jews. It wasn't because we were perceived to be a different race or any lesser than anybody else. It was because we just had this 3-year rebellion that took incredible amounts of time, energy, and money and people to put down. Also, in the later years, you would see laws at times that were specific to Jews. Was that anti-Semitic? Probably not for a long period of time, because you have to understand what's going on. In the Roman world, there was a competition to see which religion would take over the Roman world. And 2 of the top candidates were Judaism and Christianity. Obviously, Christianity wins, but when Christianity wins in Constantinople and it changes the world, the persecution of Jews were not what I would call, it was not anti-Semitic, it was competitive. It was, Jews are a real threat to the religion of the Roman Empire. We're Christian. The only real religious threat we have is Judaism. We need to put it down. And at times, even after Constantine, Constantine, years later, there was a reversal for a time, and the persecution was Christian because they wanted. So again, if you're competing, it's not necessarily anti-Semitism if you look at Judaism as a threat. Again, it's always a debate. But really, when is anti-Semitism established? The first real indication of anti-Semitism actually predates the Roman times for the Jewish world, and that is the Hanukkah story. This is probably a good example of anti-Semitism. The Syrian Greeks have taken over Israel. They've controlled what we call Israel today for a long time. It wasn't like they just took over and there's a war. They had been in control for a long period of time. And in the 160s BCE, a new ruler comes in and he creates a policy that Judaism is not allowed, that you can't pray, you can't keep kosher, you can't do circuit, all of these rules. But they came out of the blue. It wasn't a threat. Judaism wasn't a threat to the empire. The Jews living under the Syrian Greeks have been doing mostly what they were supposed to do. And all of a sudden, these new laws came in for no reason at all. Now, if the Jews had been rebelling or trying to convert the masses, that may have been different, but they weren't. The war with the Maccabees didn't start until these new policies came into place. So this is probably the first moment of not only anti-Semitism, but of religious persecution in history. Again, all of these things I'm mentioning are debatable. Of course, anybody who debates me is wrong. Just remember that. So what we see is anti-Semitism has a moment where it begins in this period 200, the 2nd century BCE, but that does not set a precedent by any stretch of the imagination, because we're not going to see a lot of it later on. We're going to see laws against Judaism, preventing conversion from others in the Roman Empire. But as we said, Judaism is considered a threat. Are we being anti-German and anti-Japanese in World War II? Was that, it was a war. It was a legitimate threat. So for some time, Judaism was considered a legitimate threat. So that period is not, I would believe, anti-Semitism. That will change. But at this point, it probably isn't. So there was discrimination that started once it was cemented that Christianity was the real Flossie.
Where did the term anti-Semitism start?
That's an excellent question. I probably should have started with this, and I don't remember. So I'm going to look that up because I don't remember. Anybody else know where that phrase, you're talking about just the phrase, right?
Phrase anti-Semitism.
I don't know when the phrase, oh, here it is. 1881 from German anti-Semitus, first used by William Marr, German radical nationalist and race agitator. All right. So that's where this, at least according to the online dictionary from the online etymology dictionary. Let's see if I have in Wikipedia, see if it goes and gives us the origins of the word. I looked it up before, but I forgot, but that may take a longer. I'll have to look that up. That's a long thing. But it could be from this anti-Semitic Jew hater in the 1880s in Germany, which is very possible because we'll talk a little bit about that age. So once Christianity is taken over, then we can see when Judaism is no longer a threat, we're not trying to convert anymore. By the 5th century with the Theodosian Codex, or the Codex of Theodosius, how do you say Theodosius?
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, Theodosianus. Okay, anyway. At this period, after the competition is really completed, late 4th, 5th century, then we can start to see some anti-Semitism, synagogues being decimated. There were rules about how you were allowed to repair synagogue. We started seeing a slight beliefs that Jews killed Jesus, starting in the 2nd century CE. So we see in the rest post-Roman world, though, we don't see as much anti-Semitism as we would think. There were rules and laws limiting Jews, but there were rules and laws limiting everybody. We were not the majority. Once Christianity really took over Europe, and after all the decimation that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire, you saw anti-Semitism, but what you really probably more saw was a limiting of somebody who wasn't us. There were limits to what non-Christians were allowed to do, and we were non-Christian. Did it always persecute us? No, but we were often the ones who were the other. In the Muslim world, we were called second-class citizens. And so you think about the Muslims taking over 6th century, 7th century, really become dominant force in the Middle East and Arabia, all the way stretching to Europe. And a lot of people say, well, anti-Semitism in the Muslim world stretches back to the foundations because they made us second-class citizens. What is the problem with saying that, Gail?
So when did the catechism start? Because I have I know it was changed. I think it was changed. But I remember one of my friends on the way to school saying, "Oh, you killed Christ."
Right. And we're going to talk about that. And that's an excellent point. So the origins of it, the cataclysm in this respect, it means a couple of different things. But cataclysm kind of means destruction, but you're talking about the idea that Jews killed Christ. The first evidence is probably the 2nd century CE. We're going to get to that in just a second. I'm going to finish up with just the Muslims, and then we'll come there, because in the Muslim world, we were considered second-class citizens, which a lot of people, and this is from the 9th century on, maybe even earlier. And so that is anti-Semitism, right? No, it is definitely not anti-Semitism. In the Muslim world, Muslims were considered higher than everybody else. We were not Muslim. Second-class citizens were given to people who were people of the book, Jews and Christians. That was a higher level than everybody else. And Jews were generally placed higher than Christians in the Muslim world. Even though legally we were both second-class citizens, the biggest difference was Christians had these big, powerful empires that the Muslims are fighting. Jews did not. So generally speaking, Jews in the Muslim world were treated better than everybody else who wasn't Muslim. And in some cases, treated better than Muslims. You look at the Golden Age of Spain and periods in, in Persia, that area, and Babylon. So the Muslim, Ron.
If the Jews were treated better than the Muslims in the Muslim world, what made
Sometimes.
it change?
One more time. We're going to go with that as well.
Okay.
So we're talking early on in the Muslim world, Jews are second-class citizens. We had a lot of skills that they used, from languages to business acumen to trading, which was a big one, to languages. I think I mentioned that. And plus, we were no threat. So often you would have Muslims who had Jews in their inner circle to get an outside opinion, but also was not worried that this person was going to overthrow them or align with somebody else. It was really an important part of that world for a long time. When Jews are kicked out of Spain, it's not because the Muslims do it, it's because the Christians have taken over Spain finally after 400 years. And that's when Jews are kicked out of Spain. Jews living in the Muslim world were treated better than the Christian world for over 1,000 years. I mean, you would have preferred to be a Jew in the Muslim world than the Christian world for most of the post-Roman period, probably all the way until the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century in places. Flossie?
Wouldn't you say in a way we have a common background with them, that they would relate more to us than a Christian?
Well, I think I think all three have common backgrounds. I think they do. I think theologically, we're probably a little bit closer to Islam than Christianity. I think the biggest difference was, again, Christians had a lot of countries and a lot of military might, and Muslims were threatened by that, as the Christian world was threatened by the Muslim world. And so you do not put what you perceive as your enemy into positions of power in your government or in your world. You have to really limit them. And the Jews were not a threat in any. Now, there were periods where you had individual Muslim rulers or groups that didn't like Jews, and there was persecution. That happened in the 12th century in Egypt. But by and large, it was preferable to live in the Muslim world. Gail, which a lot of people think is strange, but it's true. Did we lose Gail? Oh, there. Sorry.
The Old Testament and the New Testament are part of the religious readings of the Muslims. And I remember bringing this up with a Muslim colleague of mine, and he said, one of Muhammad's wives was Jewish. And so in the very, there definitely was not anti-Semitism, as you said.
Could you say it one more time, Gail? I lost
In
you for a
the
second.
beginning, there was not anti-Semitism. The books, the Old Testament is part of the religious reading.
Right.
And one of Muhammad's wives was Jewish.
Yeah, I think, and again, Muhammad had an off and on relationship with the Jewish community. He really thought Jews were going to convert. When they didn't, he got a little upset with them. But the later generations even more became more supportive of the Jewish world, again, for various reasons. People, the book. Another issue was the Muslim world was very educated. It's ironic now that it's one of the least educated places in the world today, but at that period, it was one of the most educated for many centuries. It's the only religion that starts at the top. I mean, Muhammad comes, they take over a good portion of the world and become the most educated people within a few seconds. I mean, it's like, in terms of humanity, it's a snap of a finger. And the Jews were very educated. We know this, that the education had been a stalwart of the Jewish world. In the Christian world, education was frowned upon, especially after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Dark Ages, as they call it, medieval times, education was not considered essential. In fact, it was considered illegal in many places. And the Muslim world, no. The Muslims had all the Greek stuff that got disappeared in the Christian world, the Muslims had. And the Christians got a lot of it from the Muslim world. But they were very educated. Jews had skills, were no threat, had a monotheistic view of the world, which they liked. To them, our prophet was Moses, who they appreciated as one of the most important prophets before Muhammad. So Jews were generally treated pretty well. I mean, overall, it's not even a close race between living in from 1,000, whenever Christianity kind of overtook the Europe completely, till in recent times the Muslim world was a better place to Jews. It just was, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, how that changed. But what we see is anti-Semitism, and it's hard for us to understand and believe, really did not exist in the way we think about it until about 1,000 years ago. There were moments of anti-Semitism. A lot of that was just persecution of either competitive group or just persecution of a non-Christian group like anybody else. The Christians persecuted people who were not Christian, and guess what? We weren't. And other groups were persecuted as well. When we stopped being a threat, there were times where anti-Semitism played a part, no doubt. I'm not saying there wasn't, but the anti-Semitism we see today really is based from about 1,000 years ago. In terms of this overreaching, all-encompassing anti-Semitism. And what you see is it's starting really in the 11th century. And, what you'll start to see is the blood libel. You'll start to see the Crusades, which is probably the major starting point, although there was already anti-Semitism. The Crusades really is the starting point in many ways. And starting at the end of the 11th century, the Crusades was supposed to be a holy war against the Muslims. And that, of course, was far from the truth. The truth was there were just too many men. These wealthy upper class dukes and barons and kings, they had a lot of sons, and the land was going to one. and one might go into the priesthood, but you had others, and they needed a way for these military people to do something. And so it was decided the best way was to go attack the infidels that had controlled Jerusalem. This had not been a calling point in the Christian world for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, I mean, the Muslims didn't just take Jerusalem in 1095. They had controlled it for hundreds of years. So it wasn't like this had been building. It's just all of a sudden, in many respects, not like in a day, but all of a sudden, the Muslims, which had been a threat, we need to go take Jerusalem. So they have multiple crusades, and most of the crusaders never make it out of Europe. They go rampaging through the countrysides, tearing apart, doing whatever they want. It is a very scary time, and a lot. Now they eventually do take Jerusalem for a short time, but a lot of this terror was aimed at the Jewish communities that suffered terribly during these hundreds of years. They had suffered before, not just with the blood libel, that was just the excuse. That started in 1144 in Norwich. And it continued. It's still part of the world today, the blood libel. So what we see is this belief that starts sometime in the 11th century that Jews killed Christ. Now, this is the starting point of real anti-Semitism. Why? Because when did Christ die? 3230 CE. But when does the onslaught of major persecution for Jews killing Christ start? It's not the first time it was mentioned, it's the first time it really becomes a rallying cry, and that is the 11th and 12th centuries. So that means it takes 1,000 years for the Christian world to really get upset about Christ being killed and aiming it at the Jews. That makes absolutely no sense at all. It's 1,000 years later. Flossie?
Where was the church during this?
The church was, in many cases, now at times the church was very supportive of the Jewish world. At times they were very much supportive because they didn't like chaos. But when it comes to the Crusades, they were the instigators in many respects. But just think about this. Anti-Semitism is a hate that doesn't make sense. So you wait 1,000 years to attack the group that killed Christ. Think about how ridiculous that is, waiting 1,000 years. That is a very patient group of people. Did the Hatfields and McCoys wait 1,000 years? No, the Hatfields and McCoys are not about racism or anything. That is just hate. This is undeniably hate on a level that hasn't been seen very often. Michael?
You know, this is something that we all do. I mean, history does this. We talk about the Crusades as a bunch of Christians, but this precedes Martin Luther by 500 years. It was Catholicism, not Christianity.
Right, that's a good point.
And is there a reason that you're aware of that? Why we do this? I have no idea. I never thought of it until now.
Well, again, there's always going to be some reason to it, but again, the best reason I think I've heard is that we were the scapegoat is the best reason to understand, or the easiest to understand. Catholicism, you're right, has taken over Europe. They're still really in the Dark Ages, whatever they call it. I know they've changed the names, the medieval times. They haven't found the potato yet because they haven't come to America. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of instability. drought, blight, hunger, and it comes in different waves. Overpopulation, when these things aren't happening. Whenever something is going wrong, you have to blame somebody. And there really wasn't that many people to blame. I mean, you could blame what we call the, what are they called now? They call the gypsies then. I forgot, the name they're called today.
The Roma.
Thank you, the Roma. They're a group you can blame. They're outsiders. But really, you need to blame outsiders. And this is something that sets a precedent. And the best outsiders to blame are the Jews. We look a little different. We're not Catholic. We're insulated. We have our own strange rituals. You can blame the Muslim population because there were Muslims living in Europe as well. But that's a really difficult prospect because Muslims have big countries nearby. And if they hear you persecuting their people, that could be construed as a threat. Now, if you're already at war with them during the Crusades, that's different. But why pick on the bear when you can pick on the cat? And the Jews had very little power. They were very intellectual, very skilled, and they could be used for purposes of the scapegoat. And when things went bad, they could be the ones that were persecuted. And it really was a perfect opportunity for these people to blame us for everything. And that's what happened. And through the systems they created, it became easier to blame us. So when you prohibit Jews from having jobs in most fields and you limit us to having certain jobs, they were the jobs that people most easily hated. Moneylenders are easy to hate. They have money and they want their money back. So money lending was one of the few jobs Jews were allowed to have that could make money, because obviously money lending was illegal. Charging interest was illegal in the Christian world for a time. And we have to remember, money lending was not the money lending today. Money lending was a very dangerous sport during these times, because if they saw Jewish travelers, what did they immediately think? They have money on them. That means you had to have bodyguards all the time. Your life was in danger. You had to have special ways of communicating and transporting money that was not transporting money to trade with Jews in other places on behalf of the wealthy. You had to charge exorbitant interest rates, 50, 60, 70%, because your life was always threatened. And not only that, people might just decide not to pay you back. And then you often could do nothing about it, and then you lose a fortune. And this happened all the time. Laws could be changed quickly so Jews didn't have to be paid back, which happened all the time. So it was easy to blame. Plus, Jews were great to be used for positions like paying taxes, paying rent. I own property all over. I'm going to send Jews to be the ones who collect taxes and collect the rent. Why? Because if there's a problem, they're not coming all the way over here to me. They may not even know who I am. They're going to attack the people they see. And also, you don't want to blame people within the Catholic world for these issues, because they're part of the system. You can't blame peasants for everything, because there are a lot of them and they rebel, and you need them to do the manual labor. You can't blame your crop pickers because you need them. The Catholic world had a very specific feudal system in which everyone had their role to play. And you don't want to collapse the pyramid. Flossie.
Wasn't it that Jews couldn't own land?
Yes, Jews could not own land in most places, and that was pretty consistent in the world. Even in the Muslim world, at times Jews were not allowed to own land, although that was mostly because nobody. But yes, Jews were not allowed to own land, and that goes all the way until the 19th century. I mean, 20th century in some places. Again, there's always going to be exceptions and small groups of Jews that could go above it, but that Genevieve, you had a question?
I was going to say, yeah, I had learned that because, like you said, the Christians weren't allowed to be educated. In Rome, the Romans didn't want them educated and didn't want them to read, but the Jews always made sure that their kids had read and were very well educated and very good in math. The Romans would make them be tax collectors. And then that became this whole like Jews are stingy about money and stuff like that. And that bad connotation.
That's exactly what happened. It's the Romans. Again, we put you in these jobs, and then the stereotypes come because we put you in these jobs. So again, even Jewish women could read. There was a difference in what women and Jewish men were allowed to study, but Jewish women could read. So, and again, whenever something happened, it was easy to blame. When you have the Black Plague, they got to blame somebody, and the Jews were the easiest. And sometimes the governments didn't want them to blame the Jews because sometimes governments had investments with these Jewish people. Sometimes they were needed. And also, kings, queens, barons, and dukes don't generally like rioting. They don't like people going out and taking the law into their own hands unless they're controlling it. Because if people take the law into their own hands, one day they may come after me. So we can't say that the popes and the kings were anti-Jewish because they were probably in many cases less than the rest of the population. But just because they like calm, we don't want war unless we're in charge of the war. Because we know it wasn't uncommon for peasants to kill barons and dukes and uprise. So the Jews were a convenient place to lay anti-Semitism, stereotypes. The Black Plague, obviously, is the most famous one, along with the blood libel. But there were periods where Jews did very well in the Catholic world, usually when they first moved to places because they had skills. Once those skills were absorbed into the Catholic community, they no longer served their purposes. But Jews would go from place to place trying to find the best place to live. Generally speaking, it was in the Muslim world, though. Our ancestors did much better in the Muslim world during this period. So anti-Semitism, I think a lot of people believe, starts in this era 1,000 years ago where Jews are the scapegoats. And the anti-Semitism is Jews killed Christ. That is the reason. It is religious in nature. And when Martin Luther comes, he does the same thing. He expects that Muhammad did in many respects. He thinks the Jews are going to convert because the only reason we didn't convert is because the Catholics added books to the Bible. And like in the Catholic Old Testament, they had a lot of books that Jews don't have. It's called the Apocrypha. But when he comes around in the beginning of the 16th century, the Jews do not flock to Martin Luther. And he is very upset and he becomes very vengeful against the Jews. So he was not good for the Jewish community at all. And it also creates a schism in the Christian world between the Catholics and the Protestants that creates war. And the Jews are not really benefiting from war in any situation. It just makes things worse because both sides fear Jews supporting the other because there is money there is intelligence, and it's really anti-Semitic in nature because we're so few, but it's just another issue. And so this schism causes more havoc for the Jewish world, and it's really not helpful. There are going to be periods again where one state or one king or one group is supportive of Jews, and there are really long periods where things are going well. It's not like everyday life is terrible for everybody. That is not the case. But it is a difficult world, and the stigma of killing Christ is really a shadow over us. And again, as I'll mention, the irony again is, of course, that they wait 1,000 years. And Martin Luther has somehow gotten a reputation as someone who helped the Jews, which is not the case. I mean, he had a famous pamphlet on the Jews and their lives. And he talks about how we need to have pogroms against them. We need to oppress them and kick them out of every country. It is our fault that we are not slaying them all the time. So he is actually one of the worst anti-Semites. But we also have to remember there are severe penalties for Jews in some cases. How much time do I have about? Okay. We're ordering lunch. Thank you for ordering lunch. Jews are kicked out of Spain, of England in 1290. 100 years later, we'll be kicked out of France. We'll be kicked out of course, Spain and Portugal. There are going to be places, especially Netherlands, Holland, Amsterdam, where Jews are going to be given really wonderful terms for coming in, and we really help to make those cities and city-states and countries powerful. And that's probably the best example of countries inviting Jews in and becoming really powerful economically in a short period of time. But I mean, we look at Shakespeare, and of course, he has some very anti-Semitic caricatures in his writings. But what is so ironic about Shakespeare? Now, when did Shakespeare live?
He never met a Jew.
That's right. He probably never met a Jew. He lived long after Jews had been kicked out of England, and except for a short time in Italy, where he may have run into a Jew, but there weren't that many Jews, and they weren't giving that many freedoms, but there were Jews in Italy at this period, and they did have some protection from the church. He never met a Jew. It's the reputation that went, there's a reputation for Jews in the country several hundred years after they've been kicked out. I mean, it's astounding to think that this is the case, but it is. And so this is what we see today, this beginning of anti-Semitism, but by no stretch of the imagination does anti-Semitism remain stagnant.
Maybe it's like how I don't know, in movies a lot, it seems like the bad guy tends to be like this Russian.
The bad guy, there's always bad guys, and it's always gray. But anti-Semitism remains this religious enigma in the world. But that is going to change because, as we know, religion changes. And so what you see is in the 18th century and the 19th century, we have the Age of Enlightenment. And we are looking at a world that is beginning to move into the Industrial Revolution. We've got people like Darwin changing the way we look at the Bible. We have other people who want to look at the Bible from more of a historic sense or a scientific sense, or looking at it less literally, or perhaps it even being written by multiple people over time period. So you have an age of reason in the 19th century. And you're becoming more democratic in Europe. Now, again, America is the Wild West. We can't really count America in this anti-Semitic thing because, you know, America is a different animal altogether. That's something we'll talk about separately. But in Europe, we see the change in the way we look at the world. Religion is not as popular and not as in control as it was. You have a lot of people coming out and saying that I am a-religious, or I'm not going to church anymore, or I believe in science, which is the most important one. And so what we see is a change in the way anti-Semitism works. So what you see is, instead of blaming Jews for killing Christ, we're starting to get blamed for other things, weakening the national spirit. These are what you're seeing in France, urging Jews to be sent to the gallows or expelled because of what we're doing to society. We are making society worse. But it's not as religious as it used to be. But really, the most damning anti-Semitism that comes from the 19th century is scientific. And what does the science say? That Jews are inherently worse. That's what you start to see. And we talked about it from the origins of anti-Semitism. It's in the biology, because Jews can convert out of Christianity if they want. It was pretty simple in some places that Jews can convert, and over a generation or two would be fine. But biology changes everything. Biology can't be changed. And if Jews are inherently evil or less than, then we can persecute them forever. And that's what we start to see. And it pervades not just in the Christian world, but it starts to go into the Muslim world as well. And you start seeing things of like the Protocols of Zion, or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, talking about using it as discrimination. And you start to see it seep throughout other worlds besides the Christian world. And this biology aspect is not just used against Jews, obviously. Who's it used against? Everybody who's lesser. In America, obviously, it's used mostly against African Americans, but it's used for everybody. So it's not just for Jews, but it's kind of ironic it's used for Jews in Europe, because Jews look like everybody else. I mean, already by the 19th century, after being in Europe for so long, we look like other people. It's very hard to disseminate who's Jewish just by looks. Now, you can do it in certain places, obviously, but in some places it's very difficult to do. But yet this less than idea is used for Jews. You can use it for anybody. You can use it for Muslims. You can use it for Africans. You can use it for, Slavs. You can use it for women, which is used for very much so as well. And this is really a much worse anti-Semitism anyway. Thank goodness it comes in an age where Jews are much better off. Jews obviously are much better off in the 19th century in Europe than they had been in previous centuries. Europe is going through a debate as to whether they're going to be democratic or totalitarian. And it goes back and forth in some countries, especially France. And eventually they all become democratic for the most part in Western Europe. But Jews pay a heavy price in some ways, but they're also doing much better. And they become, yes, Flossie.
In France, there was a Dreyfus incident.
Right, and that's probably the most important one. And we'll spend a little time. We'll finish up next week, but most Jews in Europe are thrilled to death with this change in policy, because going to the intellectual areas of the world, going to the using intelligence as a means to improve your life is perfect for us because we're already educated. So we thrive in this world in many respects. I mean, in the coffee shops in France, in Germany, and England, they're filled with Jews. Intellectuals, some are very famous, like Marx and Freud. And there are others. And the Jews in this world are not persecuted. They are considered equals in these intellectual havens. And universities are starting to allow Jews in, although there's still anti-Semitism there. And it's great in some ways, but in other ways it's very difficult. In the Dreyfus Affair, which we should have a whole class on easily, I had 3-part series on it. It's an incredible moment in French history in which the future of France is focused on one Jewish individual. And we'll talk about it later. Dreyfus is one of the seminal people in French history, and he didn't even care. He had it was completely bad luck on his part. He did nothing to change France. He was just a loyal French military officer. And of course, he will be remembered throughout history in so many ways for helping to change France, for, of course, helping to start the engine for the creation of Israel. There is no individual who did less, who did more. I mean, he's just a nice guy. He's a nice Jewish boy. He's good at his job. He's a lower officer. He'll probably rise a little bit more in his life and have a nice life and family. And just like any regular Jewish boy, like us, he'll have a nice life, everything. And yet he will become the tornado that almost throws France into civil war and creates the state of Israel. I mean, this one man has more of an impact on the world than almost anybody else, and he didn't do anything to do it. And poor guy had to spend 10 years in prison. So we'll talk about that next week. So next week, we're going to finish up talking about the anti-Semitism. We'll go into the Dreyfus Affair, and we may spend some time on that. And we'll talk about how this biological anti-Semitism has a very short time span compared to the Jews killed Christ. And you can probably guess why it has such a short time span. Who uses biology in a way that sends shivers up the rest of the world? And we know who it is. And they are the reason that this biological anti-Semitism is stopped almost like that in a few years, because nobody wants to be connected to the Nazis after World War. No, I mean, today we have neo-Nazis and all those people, but I'm talking about the leaders and the real people. So we'll talk about the Dreyfus Affair, into biological anti-Semitism, what comes next, and next week. And we'll probably take 2 or 3 or 4 more weeks, so we don't have to, there's no reason for us to rush this. So remember, everybody, Seersucker Shabbat this Saturday. Everybody is invited. Even if you don't have seersuckers, please come. It's just a lot of fun. Next week, we will have class online. In 2 weeks, we'll have class online, but in person at Ron and Arlene's again. That should be a lot of fun. We're looking for anybody to host a Wednesday in September. We're not going to do one in October because they'll have holidays. So if anybody's available, let me know. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Any other announcements that I forgot? Ron?
Yeah, Rabbi, you're gonna put out an email about the 14th?
Yes, I am. That'll probably go out this week. And Ron, I'm going to put your address in it, but that email is just going to go to this group. So the address, if that's okay. So it'll
Fine.
go to the 30 people who are on this email list, but we'll probably send out a note that there is going to be in person for people who want to call the office if you want to know the address. Flossie.
Tell them to either let you know or Ron and Arlene if
No,
they
wait
need
a
a
minute,
pass.
wait a minute. They should let me know, not the
Okay.
rabbi.
Okay, but that way, if they need a pass,
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's what we should put in there, that to let you know if you're coming, if you don't live in Sun City. Oh, by the way, I'm coming, Ron. Can you give me a pass?
Oh, I was gonna ask Michael to do it.
Oh, yeah. I understand you don't want to be associated with me. That's probably a small move on your part.
You're one of my pleasures, Rabbi.
oh.
Oh, well, we look forward to it, guys. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you I'll put everybody back on. Thank you for joining us live on Zoom with David and Michael and Arlene and Ron and Flossie, Gail and Eva and Genevieve today. And thank you to everybody on YouTube, especially to Arnold. I know you're watching and a couple others, so all our best. And we will see you next week at this time for the Wednesday class that shall not be named. And anything else you need, let me know.